Hey everybody, hope everybody's doing well. After Thanksgiving, it's been a week or so since I've seen most of you all, since the governor ordered everybody to go back on remote. Uh, Wanted to make some lecture videos over the last three chapters that we're going to cover before the break, chapters 10, 11, and 12. We got the revolution out of the way, and now we're going to be working on the foundation of the United States. One thing that I do want to point out, and let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. All right, one thing that I do want to point out is that if you look in classwork, all the stuff that I'll be talking about here is in Unit 4 resources. You have your Chapter 10, Chapter 11, Chapter 12 packets, like always. And this is where things are a little bit different. I have the Chapter 10, Chapter 11, and Chapter 12, the full notes. One thing I also put in there is the abbreviated notes for 11 and 12 that I've used in the past. These are here for you to look over. I hit the high points for 11 and 12 in this PowerPoint, but when I do these videos, I'm going to go ahead and use the full set of notes for 11 and 12. I'll be talking about things in these PowerPoints that I don't necessarily hit in this recap of 11 and 12, just because I have the time, while we're on remote, I have the time to record these full videos as opposed to as opposed to what I've done in the past is, sorry about that. I ended up getting an email that popped up on my watch and that distracted me. In the past, it's usually around this time of year and I'm trying to rush through some things. So I put that on there, but I'm going to use the full set of notes for my lecture videos just so we can get more information because I have the time to make the videos using the full sets of notes. I will post all of these onto the YouTube site, and I will link the playlist for the videos in here under the resources. I want to make note that we are going to have, and I made a post in the classroom stream that I'm changing the schedule on this week's schedule for November 30th through December 4th. I mentioned that we were going to have a Chapter 10 quiz on December 8th. I have changed that. Now, what I'm going to, because I was going to do a quiz over Chapter 10 and then another small test, big quiz, combining 11 and 12. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do a Unit 4 test, Chapter 10, Chapter 11, Chapter 12, and that's going to be it. We are not going to do a final exam for the fall semester. I'm just going to finish out the year. It's hard enough with everything that we've been through so far this semester. I'm just going to finish out the semester with a unit test as opposed to doing a semester exam over everything from Chapter 1 through Chapter 13. Usually I get through Chapter 18. It's just another thing we've been dealing with the crazy AB schedule or the difficulties of people being able to get stuff while we've been on remote, from August through September, end of August through September, and now that we're going from, the end of November through December 17th on remote. I've just decided that since I am a little behind where I usually am, I'm just going to do one unit test over Unit 4, Chapters 10, 11, and 12, and that's going to end up being on December 17th, which will be the last day before we start on Christmas break. It is going to be very important that if you cannot take the test on December 17th, you have to contact me ahead of time, and we're going to have to make arrangements for you to take that before December 17th, because by December 18th, I'll have to start getting grades averaged, and I'm going to have to start turning in grades to Campbellsville for the college credit. So it can't drag on. You can't email me on December 30th and say, oh, I never took the Unit 4 test. Well, if you're emailing me at that point and you haven't taken the test 13 days after you were supposed to, I'm sorry, but it's already been marked as a 0. So if you can't make it in person, well, you won't be able to do it in person because I'm going to end up being on quarantine to get ready for my daughter's surgery at that point. So we will have to do tests over Google Meet. If anything changes, I will make sure to make an announcement about that, but you have got to make sure that if that day or your class period slot does not work for you, you've got to let me know ahead of time. You can't wait until after the fact to try to explain it away because the semester will be over by then. All right, now what I want to get into today, I'm probably going to break this unit up into 3 videos, do one over chapter 10, one over 11, one over chapter 12. So without further ado, we'll get into chapter 10. Now, what we are talking about here, like I said, Unit 3, chapters 7, 8, and 9 ended up covering the lead up to the American Revolution itself and our first moves to lay the foundation for what is going to become the United States of America as a nation, as a society, as a government. And now, starting with chapter 10, the Constitution, has been ratified and goes into effect. It restructures the American government. It changes the power dynamic between states versus the federal government. And this new government that comes into shape because of the new Constitution, it's not going to be a necessarily smooth process. So, what we're going to be looking at in chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12 is the development of, the early U.S. government and how even in that short period of time, things really do end up changing in the first 20 years or so. Going from, for example, no political parties to 2 main political parties to, after a couple of election cycles, we were really down to just 1 political party. Even though everybody was the same political party, you end up having regional candidates that ran under the same party affiliation. But that'll come along a little later down the road. I want to focus on the chapter at hand here. Chapter 10, launching of the new ship of state, covers, the progress of American society from 1789, when the Constitution goes into effect, until the election of 1800. Now, as of 1789, like I said, we had already had a constitutional crisis. The Articles of Confederation, which were written 1776 to 1777, don't get adopted fully. They had to be ratified unanimously by all 13 states, colony states, however you want to call it, even though by the time they were ratified, the states technically had not been become independent yet. But we were in the process of fighting a revolution. When the Articles of Confederation were written, they were written with a lot of aspects of the document in mind, that we had been fighting what we considered an unjust, overbearing government in England. So it sets up a situation where the federal government was extremely weak. The state governments had a lot more authority, and that's going to end up creating problems from the time the Articles of Confederation were ratified in 1781 and go into effect as the document that guides how our government works, until 1787, when we call another constitutional convention to amend the articles and try to fix some of the problems that had arisen, because if we don't fix these problems, this new nation might not work. And I mean, this is just 4 years after the Treaty of Paris had been signed in 1783. These problems are already very apparent. It took 2 years to get the Constitution ratified to go into effect. And even when it was ratified, the promise had to be made of the addition of a Bill of Rights, a set of amendments to protect the rights of citizens against this new, stronger federal government. You have the rise of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, people that the Federalists supported the new Constitution and a stronger federal government. The Anti-Federalists were against the ratification of the Constitution. So when the Constitution gets ratified, goes into effect in 1789, it creates a new federal level of government, one that is going to have 3 equal branches of government, where there will be a system of checks and balances to keep one branch from being more powerful than the other 2, or 2 branches from being more powerful than the third. And at this point, America is a brand new nation. It's only been 6 years since we won our independence from the British. At this rate, we are a young nation that is growing very quickly. The population is doubling roughly every 20 years at this point, and for the foreseeable future. So it's a time of great change in this young nation. Even though the population is doubling roughly every 20 years, it's still overwhelmingly rural, agricultural. The population was still roughly 90% rural. About 5% of the population in America lived west of the Appalachians, which, of course, the way that things work out after the Treaty of Paris is we get everything from Great Britain. Of course, the 13 colonies end up being independent. I guess it'd be over on this side for you all. The 13 colonies end up becoming independent states, and Great Britain gives all the land from the Appalachian mountain chain to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes down to, close to the Gulf of Mexico, to America. And what it does is it sets up a situation where now we do have all this Western territory. The territory from the Appalachians to the Mississippi River, it basically creates a frontier that's at least double, if not almost triple, the size of the 13 states themselves. And where this was one of the issues leading up to the Revolution, that Parliament, with the Proclamation of 1760, Royal Proclamation of 1763, they were not going to allow colonists to move west of the Appalachians because of the dangers from Native American war parties. Well, now the Revolution is over with. One of the disputes during the period that the Articles of Confederation were in effect as our governing document was the dispersal of land among the states. Some states had a lot of Western territory, while some other states had little or none. Now that the U.S. Constitution is in place, we have a scenario established for how, with the Northwest Ordinance that I talked about in the last chapter, how new territories could be created and how those territories could eventually achieve statehood. Well, here in the first couple of years after the Constitution comes into effect, Vermont becomes the first new state, the 14th state that enters the Union in 1791. Kentucky ends up following as the 15th state. Tennessee ends up becoming the 16th state admitted to the Union, and Ohio becomes the 17th state admitted to the Union. Now, and of course, Vermont is within the territory of the original 13 states. Kentucky is the first Western territory. And if you look, Kentucky, then Tennessee, then Ohio, people were coming in through the Cumberland Gap, across the Appalachian Mountains, and then they were going north, or they were coming in through the Cumberland Gap in southeastern Kentucky. They were moving south, westward and south down into Tennessee. They were moving westward and north into Ohio. And you just see, because population is first flowing into Kentucky. That's the first state west of the Appalachians that in our first territory that becomes heavily populated enough that they, Congress votes to make that, establish it as a new state. Then Tennessee, then Ohio. So you can see a natural flow westward of population, and in turn, how, I talked about in chapter 9 that you had to have a set minimum population in a territory before Congress would even consider statehood. We are in a position 1789, 1791, 93, where we don't have a very good reputation. Foreigners look down on the new United States. We were still a very young nation, but we were already developing a bad reputation. We were, like, possibly in your friend group, if there's somebody among your friends, or maybe it's even you, every friend group always seems to have that one person in the group that, say you all go out to Pizza Hut or something like that to get something to eat together, and they always forget their wallet, or they don't have any money to pay for their share, or they're all, somebody that, if they come to one of their friends to borrow money, hey, can you lend me $20? You know that if you lend them money, you're making a donation. You're not lending them anything. It's not a loan, because they're never going to pay you back. That's the reputation the United States is starting to develop. At the end of the American Revolution, we were $75 million in debt when you lump together the national debt and combine all the states' debts together. We're about $75 million in debt to various countries: England, France, Spain, Denmark, Russia. And because under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government hadn't been able to create new taxes and even to collect existing tax revenue, the states could just refuse to turn over that tax money. We hadn't been able to start paying off our debts yet. So we had developed a reputation for that country that borrows money and doesn't pay it back. And at this point, by 1789, by 1791, France was deep into the French Revolution. And the economic situation in France, how dire it was, that's one of the big reasons that they end up, the revolution begins. There were a lot of economic factors that played in there. And we played a role in that because we owed France over $20 million, not by today's standards, not inflated for, or adjusted for inflation. We owed France over $20 million in 1778 value. France was already in a bad economic situation when they joined in to help us. There were a lot of French, the same way that now if the United States gets involved in a military conflict, there are a lot of Americans that say, we've got enough problems at home. We don't need to be getting involved in somebody else's war. We don't need to be spending millions or billions of dollars doing this, doing that. In France in 1778, 1779, French citizens were saying the same thing, that the king didn't need to be getting involved in a colonial war that didn't involve France originally. And really, the reason that France helped us out wasn't because they believed in our cause. It was because they wanted to pay Great Britain back for the fact that in the French and Indian War, France lost all of their colonial holdings in North America, except for a couple of small islands in the Caribbean. And, to their regret, I'm sure, France is one of the most powerful nations in the world at this point, but they didn't, the kings of France had not managed money very well over the past few generations. But then you look at the British, the Spanish, the Dutch, we hadn't been paying our debts back to them either. And it's starting to cause more tension, with people or other heads of state. Our paper money was worthless. Of course, the colonies were in a bad economic situation before the revolution begins. It only got worse when the war starts. Now, you're starting to see situations where countries in Europe are watching to see if the United States is going to succeed, because we are the first modern functioning democracy in world. This is the first real democracy that you see in the Western world since the Roman Republic. And the Roman version of democracy was very different than the version of democracy that the French philosophers during the Age of Enlightenment several decades earlier, or now this new democratic theory that's being put in place here in the United States. We're a live experiment to the rest, to Western Europe. This is a chance to see whether democracy really can work in the real world and not just be a political theory on paper that can actually function in the real world. Monarchs, scholars, intellectuals, they're all watching to see how things are going to go here. And I'm not going to lie, it was really rough going in the first few years. Of course, George Washington, he tried to retire several times. He had retired in the early, he had retired from the military in the years leading up to the American Revolution. He's called back into service to lead the Continental Army after the Revolutionary War is over with. Once again, he tries to retire and go back to Mount Vernon in Virginia, and he has to come out of retirement, and along with a few others that had money to privately fund, they have to raise a private militia to put down Shays' Rebellion because the federal government was not strong enough to enforce the call up of troops from state militias to help put down this rebellion. Constitution goes into place. It creates the president as the prime executive office, the person that's in charge of the executive branch of the government. Of course, three branches: the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. And so Washington really didn't, he wasn't like dying to be president, but again, he's pushed into service of his country, and because he realized how badly a person who exuded the qualities of leadership that he obviously had, this new nation needed a strong figure for people to look to for leadership. George Washington was a name that people knew, was a name that people trusted, not just among our founding fathers, but among the American people. So at this point, he was already, pretty much a legend among the American people. So that's why I say that he was, imposing figure. He was unanimously elected as president by the Electoral College in 1789. John Adams ends up being named the first vice president of the United States. Then, and this is something that wasn't necessarily in the Constitution, Washington creates the presidential cabinet, which he looks at as, and it was based off of the ministerial cabinet in European nations, specifically Great Britain, because that's the background that our founding fathers pretty much all had. Where if you look in the British government, you have the prime minister, and then you might have a, treasurer of the ministry or ministry of the treasury. You might have a minister of defense or a minister of war. You might have a minister of transportation, a minister of agriculture. A lot of the same. We just use a different term. Instead of minister, it's secretary. Now, the initial cabinet, and today you might have presidential secretaries in the cabinet. There might be 15, 16 different positions. At this point in history, though, the first cabinet, Washington picks, and the cabinet are there to serve as advisors, as specialists in certain areas. He creates the Secretary of State, who is to this day the country's primary diplomat, and he names Thomas Jefferson, who had been one of our biggest, most important diplomats with our main ally, France, during the Revolution. The Secretary of the Treasury, he ends up selecting Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton has some big ideas about how to correct the economic problems that our young nation is facing at this point. And as the Secretary of War, Henry Knox, a Revolutionary general that had served under Washington, he ends up selecting him because, you know, he had served with him in the Revolution. He admired, you know, the way that Knox had fought the British. He selects him as really his military advisor, the Secretary of War, because the president under this new government is, you know, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, at this point, we have a U.S. Army, but we don't have a standing army. We had a situation under the Articles of Confederation where you had state militias, and the federal government, if need, could call up those militias in the service of America, not a specific state. Well, under the Constitution, the problem that we ran into under the Articles is that a state government could deny the federal government's request. Under this situation, we are going to have an American military force, not state militias, and the president would be the commander-in-chief. And of course, in this case, it makes a lot of sense because Washington was a well-known war hero. Had served, you know, under the British in the French and Indian War, had of course led the American forces, the colonial forces during the Revolution. In modern history, a lot of our presidents have had military experience, but in some cases we've had presidents that have served that didn't have military experience, yet when the time comes, they end up being the one that, when push comes to shove, they have the final call on what the different branches of the armed forces do. Now, another thing about this is generally today, what you see is, you know, for example, when President Trump came into office, he ended up selecting cabinet people to fill cabinet positions based off of his support base, his party. You know, President Obama did the same thing when President-elect Biden ends up taking office in January of next year. Then he's going to do the same thing. He's going to fill the presidential cabinet with his own people. With George Washington, he wanted to hear everybody's point of view. He selected Thomas Jefferson, who was very, by today's standards, very left on the political spectrum. And you had Alexander Hamilton, who was very right, very conservative. Jefferson was very liberal. Hamilton was more conservative. And Washington himself was more middle ground. He was more moderate. He knew what his ideas were about certain things, but he also wanted more extreme opinions about stuff. So he hears what's coming from the left. He hears what's coming from the right. Sometimes he might lean towards Jefferson. Sometimes he might lean towards Hamilton. It doesn't mean that, you know, that's going to make the liberals happy or make, you know, all the conservatives happy, but he wanted to hear what Federalists and Anti-Federalists had to say about any issue that came up. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is the fact that with the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, there was the promise that a Bill of Rights, or states required that, or the Anti-Federalists from various states required, okay, for our state to ratify the Constitution, we need the promise that some changes will be made or some additions will be made to protect the rights of individuals, because they were afraid that this more powerful federal government could become domineering, like, you know, and it's all based off of things that these people had experienced leading up to and through the Revolution. An oppressive government from the British, or in the form of the British, corrupt courts, a federal overarching government that dominates the individual states. And when you look at the Bill of Rights, all of the the first 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, these all had to do with issues that had come up during the late colonial period. The Bill of Rights ends up being completed, and the necessary number of states, 2/3 of the states or both houses of Congress, the House and the Senate, have to vote to adopt these amendments in 1791. The First Amendment: freedom of religion, speech, or press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition. Freedom of petition would be to express your grievances against the government. And that's another thing, that a lot of people take certain amendments out of context. Sometimes when the Bill of Rights was drawn up, these were meant to protect the rights of American citizens against a federal government gone wrong. So the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, again, petition being the right to express your grievances against the government, this guaranteed freedom would protect people from being persecuted for speaking out against the government. Assembling, the same way that the Patriots were persecuted prior to the Revolution by the British-run colonial governments or by Parliament itself. Being able to say, being able to print your views, being able to assemble in groups of like-minded individuals. The way that the British contributed to the guarantee of the freedom of assembly is that laws were passed in the colonial period leading up to the Revolution, trying to keep private, public, and then later private congregations of people under a certain number of individuals. So you couldn't get, a large crowd gathered and start a riot or something like that. So again, everything that's guaranteed under the First Amendment was made that way to keep the federal government, because anti-federalists were afraid that this new constitutional government would become too powerful and it would become domineering the same way that the British government had been to the colonies prior to the Revolution. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, the ability to raise state militias. Now, today, and I myself am a proud gun owner, but a lot of people do take the Second Amendment out of context here. The right to bear arms does not mean that every American has the right to have as many guns that shoot as fast or as many bullets as they want. The Second Amendment was written to protect the right of individuals, of citizens, to form militias to fight again against a domineering, tyrannical government if this new government goes wrong. The same way that the colonial militias had risen up and started the fight against the British government at the beginning of the American Revolution. The Second Amendment: soldiers can't be housed in civilian homes during peacetime. This goes back to the Quartering Act, part of the Intolerable Acts after the British Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party, where a law gets passed in the colonies by Parliament that says that the British Army could house soldiers in your home. A lieutenant could just walk up, knock on your door, says, "This is Corporal so-and-so, this is Private so-and-so. They're going to be staying at your home for the foreseeable future for at least the next 4 months, and you're going to be responsible for their shelter and their food." It was a way for the British government to save money whilst colonists were demanding that soldiers remain deployed in North America to protect colonists from, a French threat that didn't even really exist anymore at that point, from Native Americans west of the Appalachian Mountains. But when they said, well, okay, to cut down on deployment costs, this is what we're going to do, and they passed the Quartering Act. Well, the Third Amendment, soldiers can't be housed in civilian homes during peacetime, That was a direct response to the Quartering Act of 1774. And the Fourth Amendment, no unreasonable searches, all searches require warrants. That was something that leading up to the Constitution, as the British authorities are trying to track down some of our early founding fathers, people like Sam Adams, John Hancock, that were leaders of the Sons of Liberty, or these different committees of correspondence. The British could basically just kick your door in and, raid your residence, tear everything, and say you didn't have anything to hide. Tear your home up. They didn't find anything. Well, they just leave, and you're left there trying to put the pieces back together. So now the Fourth Amendment protects Americans from unreasonable searches. And if the authorities want to search your home, if you don't give permission, they have to provide a warrant. If they provide a warrant, you can't legally bar them from your home or from your resident, from your home, from your car, if they provide a search warrant. Now, there are also stipulations there, like reasonable doubt. The argument of reasonable doubt would say that, the police were afraid that a suspect was hiding in an apartment, in a home, and if they didn't act then without a search warrant, then if they could prove that there was suspicion that that person was there, and they would potentially flee by the time a search warrant was written up. That's how they get around having a search warrant. But the Fourth Amendment protects citizens' rights from unreasonable searches and requires warrants. The Fifth Amendment, the right to refuse to speak during a civil trial, and also protection against double jeopardy. If you give your oath to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and doing so would incriminate you or prove your guilt, you can invoke the Fifth Amendment and refuse to speak, because the jury is only supposed to make their decision based off what is said in court. Now, of course, if during examination, if the prosecutor asks the defendant a question and they look at the judge and say, I would like to invoke my Fifth Amendment rights, then they don't have to answer that question, because answering that question truthfully could have possibly proven their guilt and led to them being convicted. But if they don't answer that question under the Fifth Amendment, then they didn't say anything to incriminate themselves, and the jury can't use that because they didn't admit to any wrongdoing. Double jeopardy, protection against double jeopardy, means that you can't be tried for the same crime twice. This was something that, again, the corrupt colonial courts, which were run by the British government, as they were trying to crack down on patriot leaders, they might continue to try to arrest John Hancock for certain smuggling charges, but they might try to arrest him for the same crime more than once. Well, double jeopardy, the protection from double jeopardy just means that if you get arrested, you get charged, you go to trial, and you're found innocent of that crime, they can't, or the case gets thrown out because there wasn't enough evidence, you can't be tried for that crime a second time. Like if somebody is charged with murder, they go on trial, they're found innocent, they could be tried for another murder of a different person 3 or 4 years down the road. But if new evidence if new evidence is found that, oh, this person did actually kill this first victim, they can't be tried, they can't be brought back on trial again because they were already found innocent of that murder. They would have to find some other reason to arrest that person. Now, the Sixth Amendment, right to a speedy and public trial. Our judicial system is very bogged down, and things do not exactly move speedy nowadays. It's one of the biggest complaints that you'll hear, but you will have your day in court. Another thing with the corrupt British justice system in the colonies before the Revolution is what they would do to eliminate a patriot leader is say they arrested somebody without a warrant. They just make up some charge. Before they have their arraignment, they get placed in jail. Your arraignments when your charges are read and you get to make your plea. But this was a tactic to say if they could catch Samuel Adams, if they could catch him and get him into a courtroom, they would find him guilty and he would be placed in holding. And they would just find a reason to never have his arraignment because he'd have to stay in jail until his charges were read and he made his plea. So the right to a speedy and public trial means everything's got to be in the public eye. You're guaranteed if you're arrested, you will have your arraignment quickly. And then you might have to go back to jail and await your trial. But at this point in history, or during the colonial period, you could be arrested, and who knows when your arraignment was going to be. You might spend 3 months in jail before your arraignment. The Seventh Amendment, right to trial by jury when the sum exceeds $20. Now, that's a very minuscule amount today. The amount has gone up over time with inflation, but the Seventh Amendment, a right to a trial by jury when the sum exceeds $20. Again, this was just a way to keep things public, because if it wasn't a jury trial, then the decision of guilt or innocence was solely in the hands of the judge. And the judges, by the time you get to 1773, 74, 75, judges in most colonies, in any royal colony, judges were appointed by the British government, not elected by citizens like we'll vote for our circuit judges and district judges today. The Eighth Amendment, no excessive bails and or fines. That was another way to keep people in jail that were agitators for the patriot movement. Even if they were found guilty of some misdemeanor, well, the British judge might end up setting a bail. It would be like somebody gets a ticket for jaywalking. They have to go to jail. Okay, well, it's X number of days incarcerated, or you have to pay a fine. For jaywalking, it would usually be something minimal, but if a judge says $20,000 fine or 10 days in jail, well, if that person doesn't have $20,000, they have to serve the jail term. So the Eighth Amendment kept judges from, because again, the judicial branch is a lot stronger under the Constitution than it was under the Articles of Confederation. So this was just protection to keep the legal system from becoming corrupt. No excessive bails for misdemeanor crimes. The Ninth Amendment, other rights not enumerated are also in effect. This and the 10th Amendment are both just attempts to try to preserve states' rights, because with the new Constitution, the individual states had a lot less power and authority than the states under the Constitution under the Articles of Confederation, the states had a lot more power than they did under the new Constitution. So the 9th and 10th Amendments were attempts to keep local and state governments within the power structure and not just leave all authority in the hands of the federal government. But the issue of states' rights is going to become a major point of contention for these next few chapters that we're talking about. And the argument about states' rights, what state governments had the authority to make decisions about as opposed to the federal government, it's going to be an issue all the way up through the Civil War. Now, the Judiciary Act of 1789, that created, an effective federal court system. John Jay, another one of our founding fathers that had been one of the diplomats that signed the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain, he ends up becoming the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court is created in 1789. Like I said before, Alexander Hamilton ended up having a plan for how to start to rebuild our economy, or I guess start to build our economy, since we had pretty much started off in the crapper. financially. He urged the federal government to assume its debts, which amounted to about $54 million, and to pay them off at face value plus interest. That, that was the only, that was the right thing to do. And then he pushed to assume states' debts as well, which amounted to another $21.5 million. Massachusetts had a huge debt, but Virginia didn't. Virginia also had a lot of Western territory that they could have sold off to raise revenue to pay off their state debt. This comes to the issue of the people in Virginia, the people in New York. They didn't want their tax money going to the federal government, which was going to in turn be used to pay off debts that Massachusetts or North Carolina or Pennsylvania had arisen. It would be like you being told that you're going to have to contribute money to pay off somebody else's debt. And so, this was a huge point of contention among the delegates from the various 13 states as everything is being formed in this early time period. Virginia felt it was unfair that all debts were to be assumed instead of just a set amount. Virginia representatives like James Madison, like Thomas Jefferson, they argued that, okay, we can understand assumption of debts to a point, but we should just say, okay, the federal government will take over $5 million that any state has, not the full amount, because the amounts that different states owed could be a lot larger or a lot smaller. The compromise that led to Virginia voting to ratify the Constitution and the Bill of Rights was that Virginia would end up having the District of Columbia built on its land. Another part of this would be the agreement to accept Hamilton's economic plan. They get the District of Columbia. Now, technically, DC is not part of Virginia, but it's more of a prestige issue that the nation's capital won't be in Philadelphia or New York or Boston. It's going to be farther south in land that Virginia hands over to the federal government. So while it didn't directly help Virginia, it was more of a prestige thing that the new national capital is going to be there close to Virginia as opposed to farther north with the larger, more largely populated urban centers. And in turn, they vote to accept Hamilton's plan for national debt. Now, in terms of other things that Hamilton was going to do to ignite the growth of the economy, national debt now is huge, $75 million. Of course, that's a drop in the bucket. Going back to, when I typed these notes up, 2011, notice that the federal debt was, there's 1,000, there's millions, there's billions, there's trillions. If you look at the U.S. debt clock, and we'll see if this link is going to work. Well, as of this point, December of 2020, the U.S. national debt is over $27 trillion. So it has grown greatly just in the last 10 years. The plan here was to use our debt as an asset. And of course, people were like, what do you mean use our debt as an asset? If our debt is increasing, how can that be good? How can that be an asset to the United States? Well, Hamilton's explanation was the more people that the government owed money to. Now, yes, we owe a lot to England, we owe a lot to France, but if we owe money to, it's kind of like people saying that you need to take out loans or you need to get a credit card so you can build your credit score up by borrowing money and paying it off in a timely fashion. Hamilton's argument was to use our debt as an asset. The more nations that the United States owes money to, the more countries are going to care if our government survives. If it was just that we owed money to England and we didn't owe money to France, why would France care if the United States succeeded or not? If we didn't owe Denmark money, if we didn't owe Russia money, if we didn't owe different German states or owe Spain money, why would they care if we survived or not? But the more people that we owe money to, they're going to want to make sure that the United States succeeds and survives in hopes of getting their money back. To pay off some of the debt, Hamilton first proposed customs duties or tariffs, taxes on foreign imports. It's going to protect our domestic industry, American industry, which we didn't have a lot of industry at this point, but it was going to protect domestic industry, and it would allow us to make money off foreign goods that were being sold to Americans. So he imposed a small tariff, about 8% of the value of whatever goods are being brought into the country in 1789. Then this is where we have a little bit of a problem. In 1791, Hamilton ends up getting an excise tax on whiskey passed. So anybody that produces whiskey in the United States and then sells it, a tax of 7 cents per gallon was added to whiskey. Things that I know to be true: Americans hate taxes and they love their alcohol. This causes a huge uproar when whiskey ends up being taxed. In some places, especially when our economy was struggling, it was not uncommon for people to pay for goods or services with liquor, with whiskey, because at this point you didn't have production laws in place. Anybody could have a still. Anybody could be making gin or be making whiskey, depending on the type of liquor, depending on what materials you had to work with. But anybody could be producing it. That's one of the things, when George Washington retires, when he steps down as president and goes back to Mount Vernon, he had a plantation. He didn't get a stipend. He didn't get a pension from the U.S. government. That's not going to come for quite some time. So he had to create products on his plantation. Thomas Jefferson, they grew tobacco, they grew hemp. George Washington, had a distillery on his plantation at Mount Vernon. He created whiskey, and it was a way that he made money to live on after he ends up leaving Washington. Now, like I said, the whiskey issues are going to come along a little later. Now, Hamilton and Jefferson, Hamilton also proposed, they disagreed about stuff all the time, because like I said, one is on the far left, one is on the far right, and just about any issue, if Jefferson brings up something, Hamilton's going to argue against it. If Hamilton brings something up, Jefferson's going to argue against it. They had just almost completely opposite viewpoints on pretty much every issue. Hamilton also proposes the idea of creating a national banking system. Under the Articles of Confederation, every state controlled their own economy. Every state produced their own currency. And going and trying to do business from state to state, it was almost like in Europe, neighboring countries trying to carry on trade. It was almost, the states traded with each other almost like European nations did. So Hamilton says we need, the federal government needs to be in charge of the economy. The federal government needs to establish a single American currency. The federal government should be in charge. Of course, the state can pass certain taxes, but the federal government should be in charge of most taxation. Of course, Jefferson opposes things like that. Another thing about Hamilton's model is that whenever he says we need to create a Bank of the United States, it was modeled after the Bank of England, and that was unpopular with a lot of our founding fathers, just because we had fought a war to break away from the English. We don't really want to create a new country based just strictly off that model. This new bank would end up being a private institution, but the federal government's going to be the primary stockholder. It would be used to, this wasn't the same as the Federal Reserve Bank, but it was a precursor. It would circulate cash to stimulate businesses, help our economy grow. It would be a bank, just like individuals have banking accounts. It would be a bank where the federal government could store money that's coming in from these new tariffs and these, like the tax on whiskey and stuff like that, that's generating money for the government. This would be able, this would create a situation where they could create an account for the federal government to store this money in, and then we could start paying off our debts little by little. We don't want to give France $21 million right away. We want to, slowly pay them back, because again, we want to keep them invested in our success. Also, this bank would be printing off the American currency, and it's going to be worth something because there would be money in the bank, in the government's account, to back up the value of the currency. Of course, heavily opposed by Jefferson, he felt that the state should be in charge of this, that this gave, if you give the purse, if you give the pocketbook, the wallet to the federal government, that gives them way too much power over the states if the states have to ask for money from the federal government. In terms of the views that Hamilton had versus the views that Jefferson had, looking at the Constitution, Hamilton, he had the mindset that in the Constitution, if it doesn't say that we can't do it, we must be able to. Jefferson, on the other hand, he says what was not permitted was forbidden. If it didn't specifically say in the Constitution of the United States of America, the federal government has this power, well, then they don't. So this is something that they're constantly butting heads about. Hamilton says, well, it doesn't say that we can't. Jefferson says, you're right. It doesn't say that we can, so you can't. He said that the bank was, under the Constitution, necessary and proper. It's something we have got to have in place to get our economy back on track. Jefferson, on the other hand, said banks should be controlled by the state. A federally run, a national treasury, a national bank was not mentioned in the Constitution. Therefore, it falls under the control of the Ninth Amendment. States should control that issue. Hamilton's views of the Constitution and how to interpret it evolves into what we call the elastic clause. Think about elastic. It stretches. It's got some wiggle room. Jefferson had a very static, a very concrete. Concrete doesn't jiggle a whole lot. It shouldn't jiggle at all. So his interpretation of the Constitution was very concrete. This is what it says. If it doesn't say this, then the federal government can't do it. Because Jefferson was really afraid that a federal government that was too powerful was going to become corrupt and would end up, dominating the American people. And we'd already fought a war to get away from that. The end result, Hamilton ends up winning out. Washington ends up, again, he listened to Jefferson. It's not like he just backed Hamilton all the way, which you might get that impression if you ever watched the Hamilton musical. Washington listened to Jefferson just as much as he listened to Hamilton. But he was a moderate that leaned towards the conservative argument, so he ends up siding with Hamilton. The law passes in Congress, and Washington ends up signing his Bank Act into law. Creates the Bank of the United States in 1791, and it receives a 20-year charter, which means in 1811, then it'll come up for a renewal, and Congress will have to vote, whether to approve the charter for probably another 20 years. And that is what it turns out to be, another 20 years. The Bank of the United States is going to be located in the city of Philadelphia. It's not going to be in the capital, in District of Columbia, which of course at this point it wasn't known as Washington D.C. It ends up being renamed the Washington D.C. after George Washington, I believe, after he passed away. At this point, it's just the District of Columbia. Now, it was going to start off with $10 million, basically the United States government. And I just noticed this, and I've used these notes for years. The Bank of the Untied States. That should be united. The United States government was going to invest $10 million to start off with in Philadelphia. And yes, we had $10 million. Shouldn't we have been already making some payments to our allies overseas if we wanted to keep those friends? Probably, but again, Hamilton had a plan. We're going to pay the debt off slowly but steadily. Stock was thrown open to public sale, and within 2 hours, it's like a company's IPO, initial public offering, for a private company going public and selling stock to generate revenue, to put more money into the bank. Stock was offered to the public, and within 2 hours, they had run out of shares to sell. I told you that tax on whiskey was going to cause problems down the road. Well, 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion ends up flaring up in Pennsylvania. And when fed up farmers revolted against Hamilton's excise tax, everybody hates taxes, but I told you, Americans hate taxes and they love their whiskey. And if you have a tax on whiskey, whoo, it can get nasty. Like I said, liquor, alcohol, often used as money, especially in this economic period where, paper money wasn't trusted, and, hard money, coinage wasn't readily available. This is something that Washington, again, he has Jefferson on one side saying, well, that's what the government gets. This tax was unfair. Hamilton saying it was something that we had to do, and we need to put this revolt down because the people have to know that you can't just revolt against every tax the government passes. We have to create revenue. We have to create money so we can pay off these debts that we owe to these other countries, or we're going to end up at war with other countries. So reluctantly, Washington ends up sending about 13,000 troops, and Jefferson bounces off the ceiling. This is exactly what he worried about and why he didn't like the idea of a standing American army. The fact that the federal government, that the president could send 13,000 trained soldiers in to fight against 3,000 or 4,000 farmers with hunting rifles. This is exactly what he was worried about. And the anti-federalists are just like Jefferson. They're climbing up the walls because the government is already going sideways. It's already becoming tyrannical, using the military force to subjugate the American people. Of course, their criticisms are going to be that the government's using a giant to crush a gnat. That's not really the case. But Washington, he didn't do this easily. This wasn't a decision that he made easily. He sent 13,000 troops in because that was an overwhelming force, but he had to make a point that the American people can't just take up arms and start shooting government officials, shooting soldiers, just because they don't want to pay their taxes. It's something that everybody's going to do. It's not just something unfair to you as an individual. It's something that the whole country has to do for the country to survive. Now, Hamilton's policies seem to encroach on states' rights, or at least that's the argument that Jefferson is going to make. And I should have changed the color of some of the font here. The rivalry between Hamilton and the Federalists and Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists gradually evolved into what are going to become our first two political parties, the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans and the Hamiltonian Federalist Party. The founding fathers had never envisioned various, different political parties. Whigs, Federalists, Tories, Anti-Federalists, they had existed in the past, but they weren't political parties. They were more like groups of like-minded individuals. They weren't formal political parties. Washington disliked political parties. When he ends up giving his farewell address, when he finally steps down after his second term, he warns about the formation of political parties after he leaves. He might have leaned towards the Federalist way of thinking, been a little more conservative than liberal, but he was not a member of any political party. He said that the problem you're going to run into is that people might vote for or against something simply because of the party that they claim to be a member of. That's what we call partisan politics. It's a very, very, very bad problem we have in our political system today. So, this is something that George Washington was arguing against 1795. Now, the French Revolution begins, and the first stages of the French Revolution weren't too dissimilar to what happened with America, except the American Revolution was taking place in colonies 3,000 miles away from the seat of the British government. The French Revolution was taking place in Paris. It was the people rising up and turning against the government. A few very conservative Federalists that, they still had close ties to their British heritage. They were upset at what was going on in France and the fact that certain members of our government, particularly Thomas Jefferson, were so strongly in support of the French Revolution. The revolution turned out to be extremely radical and bloody, which is something that never happened in the United States. It didn't get that radical. I mean, you did have patriots that turned against loyalists, but we didn't just start lining people. And the tarring and feathering was bad, but we didn't start lining up people and chopping the heads off of hundreds of people a day. America gets sucked into the French Revolution when France ends up declaring war on Great Britain, and now we're put in a position where we've got to choose sides. Most American citizens, their lineage, their heritage, their family was back in England, Ireland, Scotland. But France, we wouldn't have won the American Revolution. We wouldn't have won our independence if France didn't help us. And we still owed France millions of dollars at this point. So it's one of those, I have blood ties here, but they helped us out when we needed it. And both sides are looking at us saying, hey, we fought, but we're family. You should be supporting us. And the French are saying, we helped you when you needed it. Now we need it. You need to help us. That puts us in a bad position to choose. Well, it turns out that we didn't have to choose. George Washington makes the decision. He said right now we were not this guy had more military experience than anyone else in the nation. And he was in charge of our armed forces. Washington knew that war would mean disaster and our country would probably fall apart. In 1793, he issued the Neutrality Proclamation, said that the United States official position will be to stay out of the conflict between Great Britain and France, and the official stance of the government will be to be impartial. We'll carry on negotiations, trade with both countries, but don't ask us to choose sides. Americans do end up getting involved on both sides of the conflict because, again, you had some that were more conservative that supported the British side, and some of the more liberal side, they support joining the French side. But the American government as a whole did our best to stay out of it. But this made both sides mad. It's one of those situations where, say, a friend of yours, or two friends of yours, boyfriend, girlfriend, and they split up and you're friends with both of them, but they both want you to take their side in their breakup. So you try to stay out of it. Generally, that's not going to go well because this person's going to he's going to get mad because you don't side with him. She's going to get mad because you don't side with her. And you know that if you side with one or the other one's going to get that much more mad. That's what happened with our position with Great Britain and France. They both expected us to side with them against the other. And when we don't choose a side, we get pushed to war almost with both of them. The British supplied Native Americans with weapons on U.S. soil because, remember, they still had military bases. They still had trading posts on American soil. That was part of the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So they stir up problems with Native Americans and they arm them. So as we start moving west and trying to settle in the Western territories, we have a very different fight on our hands when Native Americans now have the same type of weaponry that we do. British commanders of the Royal Navy start stopping American merchant ships. I mean, at this point, we don't have much of a navy at all. And the British Navy is the most powerful one in the world. They start stopping ships, seizing about 300 merchant ships. They impress, or to impress a sailor means that they forced American sailors into service in the British Navy. Now, at this point in time, we didn't have things like driver's license and things like that that showed, hey, I'm an American citizen. Here's my ID. So what happens is the British Navy, a naval vessel would stop an American ship. Also keep in mind, we're just 10 years out of the American Revolution. You have American citizens that have British accents, that have Irish accents, that have Scottish accents. Well, if they don't have documentation, if they don't have papers signifying that they are an American citizen, which nobody had, when these British ships stop them, they catch sailors, with red hair and an Irish accent, and they say, you're going to be forced, you're being pushed into military service. We need every one of the king's subjects that we can possibly get to fight against the French. And in an Irish accent, he says, I'm an American. I moved to America 14 years ago. Okay, prove it. Well, I can't. Well, if you can't prove it, then you're going to serve the king. And the thing is our army, our navy wasn't strong enough. If we fell for this ploy, it would have pushed us to join the war on the French side. And Washington had to let it happen. It made him appear weak to an extent, but he had to let it happen because, to act would end up involving us in the war. And we didn't have the money. We didn't have the military force to do so. This causes supporters of Jefferson, Democratic Republicans, to push for war against Britain with the French, or at least to embargo. The problem is, if we start an embargo, if we cut off trade with the British, Great Britain is our greatest trade partner. That would kill Hamilton's economic plan, because it would pretty much reduce our trade to just about nothing. Washington refused because, like I said, he knew that such a drastic action like an embargo would end up destroying Hamilton's financial system. And if our economy fails, the country's going to fail. In the end, John Jay ends up, since he had diplomatic service and the fact that Thomas Jefferson was not on good terms with the British, Jay ends up, it comes to be known as Jay's Treaty. He ends up signing a treaty with the British government. It was a last-ditch attempt to avoid war with Great Britain. Hamilton caused more problems here than he solved. But again, he wants to make sure, it's one of those things where he did something bad for what he perceived as right reasons. Hamilton ends up basically giving the British all of our demands for this treaty ahead of time. The reason is he tells someone on the British side, this is what we're going to come in asking for. This is what we have to have. And he wanted to make sure that we avoided war with Great Britain. He wanted to make sure that this treaty got signed. He wants to avoid war with Great Britain. But because he told the British everything we were going to ask for, it would be like if you went in to buy, since most of you are either getting ready to drive or you already do drive, it'd be like going in to buy a new vehicle. But if a family member, you went to the car lot and another family member went in 3 hours before you got there and said, okay, this is what Colby is going to say he has to spend, but he actually has this much to spend. So when he makes his first offer here, I just want you to understand, I want him to get a vehicle, but I want you to understand if he gives you a low offer and you say no, that he's got more money that he can work with. And that's essentially what Hamilton does. He undershoots, he takes John Jay's legs out from under him in terms of being able to negotiate this treaty. We do sign a treaty, but it hurt the United States. It said nothing about future seizures of American goods, future impressment, the fact that the British were arming the natives. It's just that the British would repay lost money for ships that had been seized up to that point. America still had to pay off its pre-Revolutionary War debt to the British. As a result, it was a bad treaty. The Democratic Republicans in the South were, again, climbing the walls that Southern farmers are going to have to pay future taxes, and Northern merchants are going to be the ones that are making money because they're producing. There was no industry in the South. After his second term in office, Washington decides to step down. It's time to retire. I mean, this guy retired more times than Michael Jordan did. And by voluntarily stepping down, he creates a precedent. It wasn't a written rule, but he creates a precedent that after 2 terms as president, the standing president steps down and retires. The concept of a 2-term presidency wasn't broken until Franklin Roosevelt was elected 4 times. And as soon as FDR dies and Harry Truman takes his place as president, very quickly an amendment gets passed in Congress to limit the number of years that a president can serve. 2 consecutive terms or a total of 10 consecutive years in the case that a president dies, the vice president steps in. If, for example, if something happened to President-elect Biden in the first year of his presidency, and Vice President Kamala Harris ends up taking his place, well, if she serves 3 years of his term and then runs for a term in her own right, then that would be all she could run for president. She would have to serve under 2 years filling in for Biden. Then she could run for president for 2 terms herself. But it's 2 consecutive terms as president or 10 consecutive years in the case where a vice president steps in and takes over for a president. In his farewell address, he warns against creating permanent alliances with foreign countries because they could pull us into wars that we don't need to be involved in. And after 8 years, Washington had, even though not everybody agreed with him, Washington had created a situation where he can leave knowing that he's created a stable foundation, and hopefully his successor, who ends up being John Adams, his vice president, will end up continuing to build and strengthen this new democratic nation. Adams ends up becoming president in the election of 1796. And he was the logical choice because he was, the first vice president. He was the closest to that position. Thomas Jefferson had run against Adams. And the way that the Electoral College system was set up at this point in time is that you could have 4 people run for president. You didn't have a running mate. Like now, you have the president and the vice president, the person that runs against them, candidate, and their vice presidential candidate. They run together. At this point in time, you might have 4 people run for president. The person that gets the most votes becomes president. The person that finishes second, they become vice president. And that's what happens. It's a very close race. John Adams gets 71 electoral votes. Thomas Jefferson finishes with 68. So Adams is the president. Thomas Jefferson of the opposing political party. Adams had become a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. So you have a president of one party and a vice president of another party. Adams had a hated rival and opponent in Hamilton because even though they were both Federalists, John Adams had humiliated Hamilton. Hamilton, in turn, very publicly humiliated Adams. He plotted with President Adams' cabinet against the president, and Thomas Jefferson was his chief political rival as his vice president. So Adams was a one-term, he was the second president, and he was our first one-term president because he never really had a chance to survive beyond one term. We also had a situation with France that was getting ready to turn very ugly. France had become very angry with the treaty that we signed with the British. They took that as a sign that we sided with Great Britain. So they start attacking, they start seizing American ships, the same thing that the British had done. That leads to the XYZ affair. In 1797, John Adams sends 3 diplomats, one of those being John Marshall, future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to France, and they were approached by 3 agents who just gave the letters X, Y, and Z for their names. And they demanded 32 million florins. They didn't want American currency. Florins it was an Italian currency that was, because of the Florentine banking system, the florins were accepted all throughout Europe. They wanted 32 million florins and 250,000 American dollars as a bribe just to talk to the foreign minister, Talleyrand. They're like, look, we're not paying bribes just to speak to your foreign minister. Marshall and his diplomats, they go back to America. They explain what happened, and the vast American public ends up calling for war against France. We never declared war against France, but with what little navy we had, we were fighting against the French unofficially for the next 2.5 years. Things change when Napoleon Bonaparte ends up coming into power, and we kind of get on better terms with the French after that point. In 1798, the Federalists end up passing a series of laws aimed at Democratic Republicans. Anybody that supported Jefferson and spoke out against the Federalist Party or President Adams. Because the Federalists controlled Congress, they controlled the White House. The Federalists, they scorned the supporters or the population of the Democratic Republicans. They were poor farmers, they were poor immigrants or aliens. And because the Federalists spurned them, the Democratic Republicans knows, okay, these immigrants coming into the country, within a few years, they're going to have the right to vote. And if the Federalists talk down to them and scorn them, well, we'll accept them because that'll mean more Democratic Republican voters in the next election cycle and in future elections. So poor farmers, poor immigrants that are coming into the country constantly, the Democratic Republicans welcome them with open arms. Because the Federalists see what is happening, that the Democratic Republicans are setting the stage to be able to win future elections in 5 years, in 10 years. The only thing they can do is try to keep those people from voting. People that are speaking out against the Federalist Party, the Federalist-run government, find a way to silence them. Well, the Federalists in Congress end up raising the residency requirements for immigrants, aliens, that want to become citizens from a 5-year span to a 14-year span. And the president was allowed to deport dangerous aliens during peacetime, and during times of war, they could send them to, they could put them in jail. If we're at war with France officially, then any French immigrants could be jailed, and government really didn't have to have much of a reason for it. This is referred to as the Alien Act. The Sedition Act was meant to silence any critics of the Federalist Party or the Federalist-run government. It was aimed at newspaper editors, even politicians in the Democratic Republican Party. It was obviously unconstitutional. It was a violation of the freedom of speech, First Amendment, but the act was passed by a Federalist majority in Congress and upheld by a conservative judiciary. And Adams was president. He signed it into law because he was a Federalist too. It was set to the Sedition Act was set to expire in 1801. Well, 1800 is the next election year, so that is why it was meant to just silence the critics of the Federalists until we get through the election of 1800, hoping that that would at least give Adams a chance to win re-election. It didn't. Because the Alien and Sedition Acts were unconstitutional, Thomas Jefferson feared that the Federalists, because they're already limiting the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, might end up going after more citizens' rights. So in 1788, 1789, he writes a series of legislation and presented it in Kentucky. Even though he was Virginian, he traveled to Kentucky. He introduced this legislation, and Kentucky legislators voted to approve the Kentucky resolution. James Madison basically wrote another resolution, presented it in Virginia, that said the same thing. It wasn't as extreme as Jefferson's version, but what it does is it sets up a situation where, Kentucky and Virginia vote to accept these resolutions, and it says, we're not going to abide by this law, and this is a challenge of what I brought up before, states' rights. This is the first time that you have a state or states say, we're not going to abide by that federal law, and you can't make us. Nah, nah, nah. So the resolutions argued that federal government had exceeded its actual powers and nullified the Alien and Sedition laws. Federalists argued that it wasn't up to the individual states, that the Supreme Court is the one that determines if the Constitution has been violated and the ability to nullify laws. That they're not actually going to prove that power until 1803. I'll talk about that when we get to it. But the result is, this is going to create the baseline for the opposition to the Federalists in Congress, in the White House, in the election of 1800. And it's a prime example of the argument for states' rights. Later on down the road, all the way up to the Civil War, this is going to be the earliest case to justify the Southern view of nullifying federal laws, federal taxes. Later, the issue of succession as we get to the Civil War. Now, went too far. Now, last slide here, and this video will be done. I hope you have taken your time and broke this up into different sessions instead of watching me talk for an hour and 20 minutes. Like I said, now by 1800, we fully have formed two different political parties. You have the Federalists. Most of them had been Federalists that supported the ratification of the Constitution, but now they're an official political party. They wanted a strong government ruled by educated aristocrats. They wanted a government run by the best people. They didn't really want a government where everybody had a say. Most of them are merchants, manufacturers, shippers, business owners, wealthy, upper middle class, and upper class. In terms of foreign affairs, they were mostly pro-British. They recognized that foreign trade was key to the U.S. since they were in charge of manufacturing. Their biggest overseas market is going to be Great Britain. The Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson, desired rule by informed classes, meaning they still kind of wanted the best people to run the government. Thomas Jefferson didn't like the idea of all Americans having a say in how the government was run because he was an educated elitist and he didn't like the idea of uneducated Americans being able to vote. But he wanted a weaker central government. He wanted to preserve the sovereignty of the states. And, he agreed that national debt had to be paid off, but there's better ways to do it than the economic plan Hamilton had put in place. He thought that the upper class shouldn't receive special privileges, kind of like now, you know, the Democratic Party is, you know, looking to create more equal tax codes and things like that. He advocated the rule of the people, but not all people, just the educated people, people that weren't ignorant, because uneducated, ignorant people could make poor decisions. So even the Democratic Republicans didn't believe in true democracy. Well, that wraps up chapter 10. I mean, this was, you know, 16 slides long. I know this was a long video. Like I said, I hope you broke it up into sections. The other videos are probably going to be about like this as well. So just make sure that, you know, you take your time watching them. I'll get these posted as soon as I get the videos done. And when I do, I will link the YouTube playlist into the classroom. If you have any questions or if you need anything between now and, you know, whenever, just make sure that you email me, you know, call the school here. They'll get a message to me, make a post in the Google Classroom. The big thing is communicate. Like I said, we will end up having a test over chapters 10, 11, and 12 right before we go on Christmas break. You know, I'll give more information on the Google Classroom as we get a little closer to that time. But I will talk to you all later.